In the early hours of a cold morning in northern Germany, the fog sits low over a stretch of muddy ground. Steel shapes emerge slowly from the mist, thick armor plates, wide tracks half buried in earth, rust bleeding through layers of once carefully applied paint. The engines are silent. No crews remain. The vehicles stand abandoned, heavy and immobile, as if the war itself has simply walked away and left them behind. For months after the fighting ended, scenes like this were repeated across Europe. Fields, depots, rail sidings, and ports filled with machines that had been built for survival under fire, now stripped of purpose. Some were intact, others burned out. Many still carried the scars of combat. Among them were Britain's heaviest wartime tanks vehicles, designed not for speed or elegance, but for endurance. At the center of this silent landscape stood one question, unanswered in the immediate aftermath of victory. What would become of them now? By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was drawing to a close. Allied armies had crossed the Rhine, pushed through western Germany, and linked up with Soviet forces advancing from the east. The British Army had committed thousands of armored vehicles to the campaign, supporting infantry assaults, river crossings, and urban fighting. Among these, the Churchill tank had played a unique role. It was not the fastest, nor the most technologically advanced, but it had been built for a specific kind of war, one defined by obstacles, fortifications, and close cooperation with infantry. The Churchill had entered service during Britain's darkest hours. Conceived in 1940 after the evacuation from Dunkirk, it was shaped by fear of a prolonged defensive war and the expectation of brutal fighting against fixed positions. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Churchill was no longer experimental. It was proven, worn, and present in large numbers across the continent. Yet victory brought with it a new reality. Britain no longer needed a tank designed for trench warfare and fortified lines. The war it had been built for was over. At its peak, more than 5,600 Churchill tanks had been produced across multiple variants. They served in North Africa, Italy, Northwest Europe, and specialized roles on DAD and beyond. Some mounted standard guns. Others carried flamethrowers, bridging equipment, demolition charges, or heavy mortar. Entire regiments were equipped with Churchills adapted for engineering tasks rather than direct combat. Each vehicle represented thousands of man-hours, tons of steel, and scarce wartime resources. Together they formed a fleet that could not simply be ignored once peace arrived. The scale of Britain's armored surplus in 1945 was immense. Not only Churchills, but Cromwells, Shermans, Comets, and specialized vehicles crowded depots across Britain and occupied Europe. The British Army was already beginning a rapid demobilization. Millions of men were scheduled for release from service. Budgets were collapsing back to peacetime levels. Fuel, spare parts, and trained crews were becoming scarce. Maintaining a large armored force was no longer politically or economically sustainable. The Churchill itself posed particular challenges. Weighing approximately 40 tons, depending on variant, it was heavy for its era. Its armor thickness ranged up to 152 millimeters on later marks, making it extremely resilient, but also difficult to transport and maintain. Its twin-engine configuration, using Bedford petrol engines, required constant attention. The tank's speed rarely exceeded 15 miles per hour in optimal conditions. During the war, these limitations were accepted because the Churchill could cross ground other tanks could not. In peacetime, they became liabilities. As British forces consolidated their positions in Germany and the Low Countries, Churchill units began to stand down. Tanks were collected into temporary parks, often near rail lines or ports. Some were stripped of radios and weapons. Others were cannibalized for spare parts to keep a smaller number operational. Documentation from late 1945 shows that the British Army quickly classified most wartime Churchill variants as obsolete for future combat roles. The first decisions concerned immediate practicality. Tanks that were damaged beyond economical repair were written off on site. Burned-out hulls were scrapped locally. Vehicles with cracked armor, warped turrets, or severe mechanical failures were dismantled where they stood. Steel was salvaged and reused in reconstruction efforts across Europe. In regions where infrastructure had been destroyed, the hulks of tanks became convenient sources of raw material. Churchills that remained in serviceable condition faced a different fate. Many were shipped back to Britain, Ports such as Antwerp and Hamburg became transit points for armored vehicles awaiting transport. The process was slow. Britain's merchant fleet was still stretched thin by post-war logistics, repatriation of troops, and the movement of occupation forces. Some tanks waited months before they were moved at all. Back in Britain, storage depots filled rapidly. Open fields, former air bases, and military training grounds became parking areas for armored vehicles. Rows of Churchills sat exposed to the weather, engines drained, tracks rusting. Maintaining them was not a priority. The British Army was already looking ahead to new designs better suited to future conflicts. The wartime fleet represented the past. Technical evaluations conducted in the late 1940s were blunt. Reports noted that while the Churchill's armor and climbing ability had been valuable, its firepower was increasingly inadequate against modern tanks. Its internal layout made upgrades difficult. Its mechanical complexity increased maintenance costs. Compared to newer designs, it offered little growth potential. These conclusions sealed its fate as a frontline vehicle. Some Churchills found temporary reprieve through secondary roles. A limited number were retained for training purposes, particularly for engineer units familiar with Churchill-based specialized vehicles. Bridgelaying and recovery variants continued to serve into the late 1940s. Others were converted into armored recovery vehicles, using their strong chassis and heavy armor to tow disabled tanks. Even in these roles, they were gradually replaced by newer platforms. A small number of Churchill tanks were sold or transferred to foreign armies. In the immediate post-war years, Britain sought to strengthen allies while reducing its own surplus. Countries rebuilding their armed forces accepted British equipment at low cost. However, the Churchill's complexity limited its appeal. Unlike simpler tanks, it required a well-developed maintenance infrastructure. As a result, only a handful saw extended service abroad, often for training rather than combat. By the early 1950s, large-scale scrapping began in earnest. Steel shortages during post-war reconstruction made armored vehicles valuable as raw material. Tanks were dismantled systematically. Turrets were removed. Hulls were cut apart. Engines and gearboxes were salvaged or melted down. What had once been symbols of industrial mobilization were reduced to component parts feeding civilian industries. Very few Churchills were preserved intentionally at the time. Museums were not a priority in an era focused on rebuilding cities and economies. Tanks were associated with hardship, rationing, and loss. There was little public appetite for saving large numbers of them. Preservation efforts were limited to a handful selected by military authorities for instructional or historical reasons. Allied investigators studying German armor often examined captured enemy vehicles in detail. British equipment, by contrast, was rarely subjected to the same post-war scrutiny. The Churchill story was already considered complete. It had done its job. There was no pressing need to analyze it further. By the mid-1950s, the Churchill had effectively vanished from active British service. New tanks reflected new doctrines shaped by the Cold War faster, more heavily armed and designed for open maneuver warfare rather than methodical infantry support. The lessons of the Second World War were being reinterpreted through the lens of potential conflict with a different enemy. What remained of the Churchill existed mostly in memory, photographs, and scattered relics. Few examples survived in museums or private collections, often rescued at the last moment from scrapyards. Many bore the marks of hard-used welded repairs, mismatched parts, faded unit markings. They were reminders of a machine built under pressure, adapted repeatedly, and ultimately discarded when its purpose expired. Historians examining the Churchill today tend to view it as a product of circumstance rather than innovation. It was not a revolutionary design. It was a response to fear, urgency, and uncertainty in 1940. Its long service life was less a sign of perfection than of necessity. Britain continued to use it because it worked well enough, and because wartime conditions left little room for radical redesign. The tank's post-war fate reflects a broader truth about military technology. Weapons built for one conflict rarely transition cleanly into the next. Industrial priorities shift. Strategic assumptions change. What was once essential becomes burdensome. The Churchill, with its thick armor and slow pace, belonged to a war defined by methodical advance and prepared defenses. A world that followed demanded something else. In the end, most of Britain's Churchill tanks did not die in battle. disappeared quietly, dismantled piece by piece, their steel absorbed into a rebuilding continent. Fields were cleared, depots emptied. The rows of armored vehicles faded from view. Only a handful remained to tell the story. And so the scene returns to that fog-covered ground where steel shapes once stood, waiting for orders that would never come. The silence is complete. The engines will not start again. What remains is the imprint of weight on the earth, the memory of a machine that carried Britain through one kind of war, and then, just as decisively, was left behind when that war ended.